Hello, everyone. Today we'll be talking about a contemporary account of the nature of freedom of the will, a very influential account was put forth by Harry Frankfurt. So let us begin. Um, so Frankfurt begins by making an important distinction between what he calls sentient beings and persons. And sentient beings are beings or things that have both a body and a mind. And you can think of a mind as just consciousness, ability to think. And Frankfurt points out that historically people have thought that that's the distinctive feature of humans, the distinctive feature of persons to have both a mind and a body. But he flags that that's false. A lot of beings have minds and bodies when minds understood as consciousness. Lower animals, dogs certainly do, and things like that. So a lot of other beings also have minds in the way the matters are conscious. They have conscious states, and they have bodies, and the body and their conscience are connected in interesting ways. And yet that's not quite the distinctiveness of persons or humans. So he defines persons as beings that are moral agents, that is, beings whose actions are such that they're accountable or responsible for their actions, beings that can be virtuous or vicious, can do the right and the wrong thing. He points out that being a sentient being need not be enough for one to be a moral agent, for one to be a person. So it's the notion of persons that he cares about. So the question is, what makes one a person? If it's not merely being a sentient being, having a mind and a body, then what is it that makes one a person? And he points out that a lot of people are very tempted to say something like, oh, to be persons is to be human, and to be human is to be members of the species Homo sapiens or Homo sapiens sapiens, or whatever the most recent scientific description might be. He points out this will not do. Why? Because persons are defined as moral agents capable of doing right and wrong, and that need not be exhausted by members of our particular biological species. There could be, in principle, perhaps there are other species that are not Homo sapiens that are moral agents, say perhaps aliens or angels, or perhaps, more intriguingly, bonobos or dolphins or something like that. But at least in principle, there's a distinction between just having human DNA and being the kinds of beings that are responsible for our actions. He also points out that it turns out that being a member of the species Homo sapiens is not enough for one to be a person. So not only is it the case that there could be, or perhaps there are, persons that are not members of Homo sapiens, that are not humans, biologically speaking, but also some beings that are Homo sapiens, humans biologically speaking, are not persons. And what he has in mind are like people in the state of coma, or very young children, or perhaps people with severe mental impairing disabilities, something like that. So people that do qualify to have human DNA to grow in different ways, yet it seems to be a mistake to treat them as though they're responsible for their actions if they act. Like if a 2-year-old, breaks a precious mug of the father, it would be foolish of the father to treat that as a malicious act. It was an accident. The child does not have not developed the capacities to be malicious. That's much too sophisticated of a mental state for a 2-year-old. So they're Homo sapiens, but they're not moral agents yet. So they're not persons yet. They're in the state of development towards being a person. But anyway, so the answer: persons are humans, and humans are, but Homo sapiens just won't do. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about morality, not mere biological facts. So here's what he says. It is my view that one essential difference between persons and other creatures is to be found in the structure of the person's will. To be a person is to have a particular kind of will. In fact, to have a will that is structured in the right way. That's the main point of the paper. So we'll spend some time trying to make sense of what that is. So the quote continues. Human beings are not alone in having desires and motives and in making choices. He thinks dogs have desires. They have motivations. They make choices. By choices, he just means the desires and motivations that are strongest and thereby settle the action. A dog might want to run, might want to drink water, and then we'll do one or the other. And the thought is the strongest desire will be the one that settles the dog's action. And let's just call that the choice. The choice just is the internal motivation for action that ends up being the triumphant motivation. And that's how Frankfurt puts it. So we humans do that, right? We're biological beings. We have, desires and so on that settle our actions in all sorts of ways, but other beings do it too. So that's not distinctive of us as persons. They share these things with the members of certain other species, some of whom even appear to engage in deliberation and to make decisions based upon prior thought. So Frankfurt points out that, say, dogs sometimes seem to deliberate. There's an object that they desire, something at the top of the table, and they notice it. They desire, they want to get it, and they like look around for ways of getting on the table. They see a chair, so they push the chair and get on top of the chair and jump up it, right? So they engage in a kind of deliberation. They contemplate alternatives. The SS means whereby they can attain their desired goal, right? So lower animals can in fact engage in a kind of deliberation process, a conscious deliberation process, and then choose on the basis of that. Frankfurt thinks, we can see that's some other non-human beings do that. And crucially, Frankfurt thinks they're still not persons. Dogs are not persons. I mean, that's the example here. But the beings that are capable of deliberation in action on the basis of deliberation have not yet attained the status that makes them responsible for their actions and agents. So he continues, it seems to be a peculiar characteristic of humans or persons that they are able to form what I should call second order desires, or second order desires of the second order. So Frankfurt's main claim is this one. The distinction, what makes a being be a person, is that they have the second order desires. If it turns out dogs do have that, then never mind, they are persons. But he thinks that they don't have it. But that's a farther claim, right? The conceptual claim is that whatever beings only have what he's going to call first order desires, that is, desires to act in a particular way, are not yet persons. They're not responsible for their actions. It takes having the capacity to form second order desires that makes one a person and thereby responsible for one actions. And that's the conceptual claim. So let's describe that a little bit more carefully. So first order desires are contrasted with second order desires. A first order desire or volition are the motivations that explain why agents do what they do. When you sit here and play the piano, like this picture here, when you drink water, when you drink coffee, when you go for a walk, whenever you act in the world, there's a reason, if it's an action, why you did what you did. And the reason has to do with the motivation, why you wanted to do that. You're playing the piano to entertain your guest, you're drinking water because you're thirsty and so on, right? So there's this desire to satiate your thirst, there's this desire to keep your guest entertained, and so those desires are the ones that settle or explain the actions of the agent. Those are first order volitions or first order desires, the ones that settle the actions for people. So first order desires feel a particular way. They have a particular kind of phenomenology. You know if you have the desire to entertain your guest. You know if you have the desire for coffee. You know if you have the desire for water. Why? Because it feels a particular way. Desires manifest themselves in your phenomenology, the way your experience feels to you. Those are the first order desires. They feel a particular way, and they're directed at actions. Their desires to entertain the guest, their desires to drink the water, right? Their desires whose goal is a particular action. Contrast, second order volitions or desires are desires about first order desires. So they're not desires to act in a particular way, but they're desires to have other desires to act. So be able to form these second order desires, one must be able to reflect upon, to notice one's own first order desires, motivations, right? So suppose you're playing video game and the day after that, playing some video games, and the day after that you have an exam. So you want to study for the exam, you have this desire, this motivation to be prepared for the next day, but you also have the desire to keep on playing, right? So there's this conflicting set of first order desires, one that pushes towards turn off the video game, start, studying for tomorrow's exam, and the other one that says, no, let's keep going for a little bit, right? So there's this internal battle in your psychology of two different competing desires that point to different actions. And then the one that wins is the strongest one. You might end up keep playing, or go and study. But anyway, that's that interplay between two of your desires that try to settle your action. For you to develop second order desires is for you to reflect upon your inner psychology, your inner motivations, and to notice that you have two conflicting desires that go one way or the other. And then once you reflect upon your inner psychological struggle, you may come to form this second order desire, the desire that your desire for studying be stronger than the desire for playing the game. Now, because it is a desire about desires, it need not like win, right? So you might keep playing and then lament to yourself, "Oh, really hope, I really wish my desire to, study would have won this battle," right? So you can find yourself in this weird predicament in which your strongest first order desire to say play the video games wins, and you're there playing the video games, but all the while thinking to yourself, why am I doing this? Like, I really want to be the kind of person that is committed to studying, and I'm not doing that, right? So you lament the fact that the desire that won is the one that won. You wanted a different one. And a different way of saying that is that you formed the desire to be the kind of person for whom the desire to study is stronger. And it turns out you're not that kind of a person, right? There's a mismatch between your second order desire and your first order desire. The one to win is not the one you wanted to win. And Frankfurt thinks that kind of description of your inner psychology, it's only an inner description of what happens in the inner psychologies of persons. The distinctive characteristic is exactly that, that capacity to reflect upon your first order desires, to form second order desires, and ultimately to influence the first order desires on the basis of the second order desires. But it is the capacity to do that second order desire formation that makes you a person, he thinks. So have or form a second order volition or desire about a first order volition is to identify with the first order volition, right? So you want your desire for study to win instead of the one for playing video games. A different way of saying that is you identify with the desire for studying. You want that to be the one that settles your action, and you want to be the person that is such that that desire wins. And your desire, second order desire, may end up winning, but may not. And even if it doesn't win, the fact that you have it makes you a person. So to have a second order desire is to want to be the kind of person that is motivated to act in a particular way. And you may be motivated to act that way, you may not be motivated to act that way, but that you want to be the kind of person that is motivated is to have a second order desire. So here's an example. Suppose that a friend of yours is patient and kind. You notice that they're motivated to act, to respond in the world in a patient and kind manner in a way that you're not. You're impatient, you're rough, and like you notice that the way you're motivated to respond to situations, stressful situation, is not the same way that your friend. And you also, as you reflect upon these things, think, I want to be like my friend. I want to be the kind of person for whom patience and kindness is natural. I want to be motivated to act that way. To the extent that you do that, you form the second order desire to be a particular kind of person, and that's what it makes you a person. So a different way of trying to lay this out is to make the distinction between being a wantum and being a person. So a wantum is a being that has first order volition. So it's a sentient being, someone who has a mind, has a body, but that does not have the capacity to reflect upon their own like first order desires and their struggles and their motivations and the way in which they settle their actions. It's like perhaps the dog. When the dog sees the treat on top of the table, he notices that the treat. He's motivated to act in the base of the treat. He looks around to see how he gets there. But the thought is, at no point does the dog think about himself being motivated in the particular way, and at no point does the dog form the judgment. I do want to be the dog that goes up to the treat, or I want to be the dog that does not go up to the treat, say because the owner or the parent would be upset. The dog doesn't do that, right? The dog just has first order desires and tries to like navigate the world in such a way that those desires are satisfied. It seems anyway. Wantums do that though. To be a wantum is just to have first order desires. A wantum acts simply because they want to at the moment. They feel like eating, so they eat if there are no obstacles. They feel like going after the treat, so they go after the treat. This way of putting it, they just respond to the moment, might make it seem like wantums cannot deliberate. And again, Frankfurt says that's a mistake. Maybe lower level wantums don't deliberate at all, but in principle, wantums can deliberate. So perhaps dogs, again, are sophisticated enough to look at alternatives and to try to figure out how to go about the means whereby they can satisfy the desires, right? That's a kind of deliberation. But crucially, it's a deliberation about how to attain the objects of their first order desires. The deliberation at no point becomes self-reflective, that part of the kind of object of inquiry is the very structure of the motivation, and much less does not involve any formation of desires or volitions about what that structure should look like, that first order volition structure should look like. So a wanting can deliberate about what to do and how to attain what he desires, what she desires, even about what he desires more strongly, but not about whether or not her desires are themselves desirable. The wantum never questions the desirability of the desire, so the object of the desires. The essential characteristic of a wantum is that he does not care about his will. He doesn't have the capacity to care about his will. He only has the capacity to will things and then try to attain those things. To form, it's a much more sophisticated capacity to reflect upon one's will and then to care about having it or not having it. His desire moves him to do certain things without it being true of him, either that he wants to be moved that way or that he does not want to be moved that way. He just is moved that way. Contrast, when a person acts, desires, the first order desires by which she is moved is either the will that he wants or the will that he wants to be without. If you're a person, you form second order volitions, you're sitting there playing video games, either you play the video games, your action is set up by your desire to play video games because that's what you want to do, that you have formed the desire to be the kind of person for whom video games are very important and take a lot of your time, or you stay there playing video games despite the fact that you want to be the person for whom video games are not essential, you want to do something else like study for the exam, and yet that other thing you want, that desire to play, to study for the exam, does not win the first order battle of desires, right? When a person acts, is one of those two options. When a wantum acts, is neither. They just want to do it, so they do it. So wantum is that simply the product of the environmental factors working upon the genetic preconditions of the biology of the wantum. We can say that, Frankfurt says, wantums have freedom of action. When you take your dog to the park and you have the dog in the leash, and then the dog sees the park and the dog wants to, right? It's motivated to run in the park because running is so cool. If you have the dog in the leash, for that particular action, the dog is not free to act, right? Because you have him in a leash. But once you remove the leash, then the dog can just freely run, in some important sense of free. What's the sense of free? Freedom of action, says Frankfurt. A being, a wantum, can have freedom of action when there are no external impediments for the desires to convert into actions. The dog wants to run instead of, say, drinking water, that the strongest desire is to run. And if there are no physical impediments like a leash, then they get to do it, right? They're free to act on the basis of the desires. That's freedom of action. Crucially, he thinks only persons have freedom of will, which is the ground for moral responsibility. Freedom of action is not enough for moral responsibility. Freedom of will is. So let's talk about that. So freedom of will, what is that thing? So here's what Frankfurt says. Just as the question about the freedom of an agent's action has to do with whether it is the action he wants to perform. In other words, is the dog freely running? Well, did he want it to run? Yes. Were there any impediments to her running? No. Okay, then he's freely running. When the dog is being held by the leash, is the dog being freely held by the leash? Well, you're holding it, but it's not being held freely, right? It wants to run. So when it's being held against its will, the dog does not enjoy freedom of action. So whether the dog enjoys freedom of action has to do with whether or not the desires, first order desires, do manage to settle the dog's action and not some external impediment like your leash. Likewise, says Frankfurt, the question about the freedom of the will has to do with whether or not a person has the will that he wants to have. So it is a matter of the second order volitions or second order desires that settles whether or not your will is free. So let's put forth some definitions, try to spell this out, what this amounts to. So freedom of action, again, is when an agent acts as she wants to. The first order desire settles the action, that she's free. So there are no external impediments from the first order volition to the action. That's relatively straightforward. Freedom of will is significantly more complicated, and it involves second order volitions. Here's the cool way of saying what Frankfurt's after. Freedom of the will is when an agent wants what he wants to want and can want something else instead. So when you act and you your first order desire is for that action, say to study for the exam. So you're thinking about playing video games to study for the exam, and your strongest desire is to study for the exam, and you study for the exam. That's one point. And you have reflected upon your motivations, and you think, I want to be the kind of person for whom a desire for studying for the exam wins. So your second order desire is in alignment with your first order desire that settles the action. You have freedom of the will if, in that case, because you want what you want to want. You have your first order desire being what your second order desire has it as what your second order desire wants it to be. So you're free, you have freedom of the will when your first order volitions, your desires, the state of your actions, are in alignment with and are settled by your second order volitions. And these are settled by part matters as well. It's not merely that your second order desire aligns with your first order desire, but that you have the first order desire because you have thought about, and in some sense, it's influenced by and it's settled by your thoughtful deliberation about which kind of person you want to be, and then your second order desire settles your first order desire, and that's why you act. So you're fully in control of your actions, and you have freedom of the will when you're studying for the exam. And that's your desire wins, so that settles your action. You have thought about it, you want to be the kind of person for whom that desire wins, and that's why you study for the exam. So a way of bringing this out is by having three different addicts, three different ways in which you like freedom of the will, or someone can like freedom of the will. So one way in which one cannot have freedom of the will is if you're a one-time addict. An addict is someone who's the object of the desire, the drug, overwhelms the agency and settles, right? It is the drug that makes the agent act. So if you're a one-time addict, you like the freedom of the will because you like the second order volition about this desire for the drug. The desire for the drug is overwhelmed by the drug and it settles the action, and you have no second order volition. So you're not free. If you're a willing addict, however, someone who's an addict, so the desire, the drug gives rise to a strong desire that trumps the other desires. So you're an addict. You're a willing addict if you reflect upon that and you say, yay, that's cool. I want to be that kind of person for whom addiction is a thing, right? So that makes you a willing addict. You want to be addicted to the drug. Frankfurt, you might have thought, hey, there's alignment between the first order and the second order volition, right? The first order volition is the strong desire, the addictive desire. The second order volition is you want to have that desire. So, hey, you're free. Frankfurt says you're responsible for your action because of the alignment, but you're not truly free. You're not truly free because your first order desire for the drug is not settled by the second order desire to be the kind of person for whom the desire wins. The first order desire is settled by the drug, and therefore it's not settled in the right way. You're not in control over your actions in the same way in which a free agent is. So let's contrast that with the third way in which your freedom of action might be lacking, freedom of will might be lacking. So the unwilling addict, and this brings out why the willing addict is not fully free. The unwilling addict is the one whose first order desire for the drug wins. That's why he's an addict. But he has reflected upon that. She has reflected upon that and has concluded, I don't like this. I don't want to be the person for whom that desire wins. I want to do something else, like have a stable relationship, have a career, something else that is not using the drugs. So their second order desire is for some other first order desire to be the one that wins, say, having a career or something else, not taking the drug. And yet, because they're addicts, the first order desire for the drug wins and they keep doing it. So they have this internal psychological stress. Their actions are not in accordance with what their second order desires want. So they lack freedom of the will because his second order desire fails to secure or bring about or settle the corresponding first order desire. The second order desire is the desire not to take the drug, but to do something else. And yet the first order desire that wins is the one for the drug. That's why the unwilling addict does not have freedom of the will. So freedom of the will is when the desires that settle your actions are desires that you identify with. You identify with those by reflecting about your motivation, informing the second order structure that's the one you wanted to win. And ultimately that second order desire is the one that settles in the long run, your first order desire being the one that wins. Your second order desire you desire to be the kind of person, be a particular kind of person, is the ultimate reason why you are the kind of person. That's when you have freedom of the will. Okay, well, I'll stop here. Bye.